Okay, so let's start. So are there any questions on what I did last time? Alright, so let me remind you that the key observation from the last lecture was that if you parallel transport a vector around an infinitesimal loop, then we derive that the variation of that vector is a half some rotation matrix of the original vector times the area of the loop around which we took it. So this is a linear transformation, and this is true with R being defined as a sum of four terms. Two of them are first derivatives of gamma. So I, K, M, comma, L. And this thing we call the Riemann curvature tensor, and it's manifestly dependent on second derivatives of the metric as well as first derivatives of the metric as well as the metric itself, and no higher derivatives than second, because here is one derivative explicitly, and then inside the definition of gamma there is one derivative also. So at most two derivatives. Now this equation already tells us that R has to be a tensor, because clearly the vector is, because we started with, this is a vector, this is an area element, so it's a second rank tensor. The change in the vector is a vector, so R has to be a tensor. So it's rather interesting that we've managed, and notice that it's for the first time, we've built up a tensor starting from the metric and nothing else. It's the first time we found a tensor. The only other thing the metric itself is a tensor obviously, but then we studied its first derivatives and those define gamma, but gamma is not a tensor. Okay. The second derivatives, if combined in this form, give me an object, each term of it is clearly not a tensor, right? Because gamma is not a tensor. So there is no reason why the first derivative of gamma should be a tensor. Okay, gamma has an inhomogeneous term in its transformation after change of coordinates. So the first derivative will only make things worse. It's not a covariant derivative, these are ordinary derivatives. So this is not a tensor, this is not a tensor, this is not a tensor, and that's not a tensor. But wonderfully, if you add up all of them, the result is a tensor. So all the bad things that happen under change of coordinates cancel out when we take exactly this combination of gammas. Okay. That's sort of a prediction from this fact, but again you can check it. It's very painful, but you can check it. You simply plug in the inhomogeneous transformation law of gamma into this and check that all the bad terms cancel out. So finally, under change of coordinates, R I K L M transformed as a tensor. I could write the transformation law for you, but it's too much of a pain. You can do it yourself. In this form, there is one factor for this contravariant index and three factors for the covariant indices. Of course, you can also take R and raise and lower indices, and whatever you do, it will transform as that kind of tensor. Okay. Now one more result, which for some reason I've forgotten to write down here, I think. Oh, I know. Because I was planning to do it last time and I didn't. Yes. Is that there's another way to define R, which is more or less the same as this, but it's mathematically it's very simple. It doesn't involve specifying any loop or parallel transporting any object. Another way to define R is to say the following. Let's take a vector field, and let's differentiate it once, and then let's differentiate it again in two independent directions, and let's compare the result with the result of differentiating it in the reverse order. So what is that? Take an arbitrary vector wk, act on it with di dj, but subtract from that the action of dj di. Okay, commutator of covariant derivatives. This thing can also be written as di dj wk. Let's just consider this object. Okay, and what I claim is that if you calculate this, now there's again everything is well defined. You know how to take d on w, there's a definition. You know how to take another d on that thing, there's a definition. Now you get a whole bunch of terms from there, and you have to take that bunch of terms and subtract what you get by interchanging j and I. Now notice that in that bunch of terms, there will be second derivatives acting on w, because from two capital D's I can take out the ordinary derivative part, so there are two of those. But you see that those cancel when I subtract the reverse thing. There will also be first derivative terms acting on w by taking a derivative from one of them and a Christoffel symbol from the other one. It's nice, it's easy to check that those also cancel. So at the end, it turns out that you simply get some combination of Christoffel symbols and their derivatives acting on w itself. In other words, the answer for this operation is local in w and doesn't involve any derivatives of w. And in fact, it's nothing but, getting the indices right, R, K, L, I, J, and W. Now I leave it to you to compare this derivation and the derivation going on the loop. Morally they are the same, but there we explicitly said we are parallel transporting W, which means that at every stage when we transport it, we use the parallel transport equation and so on. Here we don't say anything, we just calculate this and this is the answer. Okay, but it's remarkable that the answer doesn't involve dw by dx or d2w by dx squared, but only something times w, and that thing we define to be R, the commutator of covariant derivatives. Now one side comment to relate it to some other things you might have seen in physics. First side comment, of course, is that if there were no covariant derivatives but only ordinary ones, then their commutator is 0. The most important thing about differentiation is that two differentiations of a function of many variables simply commute. So failure to commute is due to the presence of extra terms in the covariant derivative, and indeed that's the result. Now, where have we seen this before? Has anyone seen this before in some other system not related with gravity? Gates. Good. Is everyone familiar with this fact? Then I don't have to perhaps do it. Or would anyone like me to show you? Yes. Okay. Good. So we have a Dirac equation, for example, which acting on a fermion wave function psi involves an operator. It involves something called gamma matrices, which are not very important for this discussion, but also involves this kind of structure. So this is the equation, the free Dirac equation. Otherwise, there might be stuff on the right side. The important thing is, this is how the four-vector potential of electromagnetism couples to a fermion field. It couples in such a way that the ordinary derivative del mu, which is del by del x mu, which is quite the same as the ordinary derivative part of this thing, is modified by the addition of a term depending on whatever is going on in the background, which is an electrostatic, which is an electromagnetic for potential. Okay, so this quantity in electromagnetism can be called d mu, and it's also a covariant derivative. It's covariant for a different purpose. It's covariant with respect to the symmetry transformation of electromagnetism, which is gauge invariance, unlike this one, which is covariant for general coordinate transformations. Okay, but the structure is the same. It's ordinary derivative plus some field which represents the physical background, in this case electromagnetic background, in this case the Christoffel symbol which represents the gravitational background, because it depends on G. Alright, so far so good. Now, what's the commutator of two of these when acting on a fermion? So it's del mu minus A mu, commutator del mu minus A mu. So you can do it in your head more or less. There will be terms del mu, psi, but those cancel when I anti-symmetrize. There will be terms where del mu acts on psi and then multiplies on A, those also cancel. But there will be terms when this del acts on this A and this del acts on this A. And if you work it out, you will find that you get minus I del mu A mu minus del mu A mu times psi. Same phenomenon. At the end of the day, we found that the commutator of derivatives involves just a multiplicative factor on psi. No derivatives of psi are left after we perform the anti-symmetrization in mu and nu. Okay. Not only that, this is an extremely familiar object in electromagnetism. It's the field strength. And so we see that in electromagnetism, A mu is sometimes called a connection or a gauge connection, otherwise we know it as the electromagnetic field, and this is called the field strength of that connection. It's very similar there. The extra term in capital B is the Christoffel symbol, that's also called an affine connection, and the Riemann curvature is the field strength of that. The number of indices in these problems is different. For example, here there are no hidden indices. A just has one index, so its field strength has two indices. But there, the Christoffel symbol has three indices, so its field strength has four indices. It's just so. Okay. In the non-abelian case, for those of you who are familiar with non-abelian gauge theory, there will be more indices. In fact, A will have will be a matrix, it will have matrix indices, and F will also become a matrix in those indices, so it will have two down and two indices up, so four indices. And there the analogy with the Riemann curvature is even closer. And when we discuss tangent frames on manifolds, then the analogy will be still closer. It will turn out that that phenomenon and this are almost exactly the same. Okay. Good. So now that we've got
define that as some kind of a non-abelian gauge theory.
Yes, you can.
And even the gravity.
Yes, in terms of tangent frames, it's in fact gravity is nothing but the Riemann curvature is nothing but the field strength of a non-abelian spin connection. We'll see. That's something I'll do later in the course. Okay. Now it's standard in the books to huff and puff a lot to find properties of the Riemann tensor, but it's extremely easy to do it if we just use a little bit of intelligence. What I'm going to do is to derive the properties not of R with one index up, but R with all indices down. And that's obtained by acting with this G to bring this index down. Okay, it turns out the properties of this thing are simpler. Now, this of course you can plug into the original definition of R, which is gone up somewhere. Yeah, here. The board is very slow. So you can act with G on the left side and the right side of that equation, and you get the answer for R with all indices lowered. What we are going to do is only write the first two terms of that, because the other two terms can be brought to 0 by opportunely choosing a system of coordinates in which first derivatives of the metric vanish at a point. Okay, so it's enough if we choose that at a particular point and find some properties of R which are valid at that point. Then they'll be valid in all coordinate systems because R is a tensor, and they'll be valid at all points because we can repeat this process for every point. So that's our strategy. By the way, I didn't perhaps give a name to that coordinate system, but the coordinate system where Gij equals delta Ij and Gij equals 0 at a point goes by the name of Riemann normal coordinates. My history is not very good, but apparently it was discovered by Gauss and not Riemann. I don't know. Anyway, so this is what it's called, and I'll be using it repeatedly in this course. So let's just give it a name. RNC is for Riemann normal coordinates. Okay. Now in these coordinates, it's an extremely easy exercise to see that Rijkl is written directly in terms of the metric as half G. So we expected to have only those terms which come from the first derivatives of the Christoffel symbol, but now we've evaluated those terms, and that's what you get. There's some partial cancellation between the two terms, gamma ijk, comma L and the other one, and at the end you get this. And besides this, in general coordinate system, there will be terms involving first derivatives of the metric, but in RNC, this is the whole answer. Okay. So this can be worked out very easily. So what does this answer teach us? Well, it teaches us all the symmetries of the Riemann tensor. You can just see them by inspection. Rijkl is equal to minus Rijlk. This is no great surprise. If you remember, the last two indices were associated with the area element of a loop, so we knew that it was antisymmetric. Bit more of a surprise is that in the first pair of indices, it's also antisymmetric. You can see it just by looking at that. And the third surprise is that if I interchange the first and last pairs, I get the same thing, it's symmetric. The pair Ij and the pair Kl, I flip them, then it's the same. You can see that these two terms get exchanged under that operation. Is that right? Ij and Kl, so in place of I get K, and in place of J I get L. Have I written something wrong? Why is this correct? Yeah, sorry. I replaced my Kj by L, of course. These two are the same, and these two get interchanged. Yeah. Good. And there's a fourth one, which is there's a fourth relation, and that's the end of it, which says that if I take Rijkl and add to it the terms obtained by cyclically commuting the last three indices only, then I get 0. To see this one, you take that 4 terms and add another 4 terms for this and another 4 terms for this. You've got 12 terms, 6 are plus signs, 6 are minus signs, and you'll see that they cancel pair terms. Again, very easy to derive. Okay, so this is a bunch of identities, and in fact, it is a complete bunch of identities satisfied by R alone without involving any other tensors or derivatives. These are just internal identities on the for index object R. And the thing which will be in your homework assignment, which I was trying to complete, but it will be complete next week, is to show, let me write it here anyway, show that in d dimensions, without any of these, of course, R would have d to the fourth components. Okay, each component can take d values, but of course all these things cut down the number of independent components. So at the end, R turns out to have d squared into d squared minus 1 over 12 components. Since we are doing all this study of curvature and manifolds and spaces only for low enough dimensions, we can focus on the cases we are likely to be interested in. So for d equals 2, this formula returns 1. So R has only one component. Okay, one independent component. Why is that? It's pretty obvious, because if there are two coordinates, let's call those coordinates 1 and 2. So I and j go over the values 1 and 2. The only thing we can write is R12, 1, 2. Alright, you can't keep the first two indices the same because it's antisymmetric in that pair. So 1, 1 is not there, 2, 2 is not there, so it can only be 1, 2 or 2, 1, but they are related to each other because of antisymmetry. So R with 1, 2 here and R with 2, 1 here are minus of each other by the first relation or the second relation. Likewise for the second index. And of course, the interchange of these two is manifestly obeyed, and it's easy to check that this last thing is also obeyed. So there's only one component of curvature, and that sort of fits with the fact that when we have a two-dimensional space like this sphere we keep imagining, somehow there's a natural, well, actually I can't prove that, but there's only one natural thing that corresponds to curvature. Okay, even though it's described by a fourth rank tensor, turns out that there's finally only one. So in 3 dimensions, instead the formula returns what? 9 times 8 over 12, which is 6 components. And in 4 dimensions, which is the case of interest in general relativity, it returns 10. 20, sorry. That's correct. So 20 is the number of independent components of the Riemann curvature tensor. So space-time, the curvature of space-time has to be measured in full detail by a tensor which has 20 independent components, and that's pretty hard to visualize. So you'll be very grateful whenever we do examples in 2 dimensions where instead there's only one. Okay, you could say, I think correctly, that a lot of extra complication comes in when going from 2 dimensions to 4 dimensions, but 4 is the case of interest. Okay. Now, by the way, I was informed that this room is booked from 5 o'clock. I don't know if it's really true, but anyway, I'll be trying to end by 5. Okay. Now, from R, IJKL, we can construct some new objects, new only in the sense that they are tensors obtained by linear combinations of these using the metric. So take RIJKL, and let me try to contract two of the indices using the metric G with upper indices, 2 upper indices. So it's the inverse metric. Now I can't contract I and J because this is anti-symmetric in I and J. So if I put in Gij, which is symmetric, then I'll get 0.
Is this d square to d minus 1 by 12 valid for all d? Because it might give, fractional quantities.
That's a hypothesis which doesn't turn out to be true. Just we are hypothesizing that it might give, but if we've done this right, then it won't give. Let's do the exercise. Let's do it for the equals 10. So 9900 is 9900 divisible by 12? I believe it is. Now we proved it for 10, so it must be 2.
Except for 1 and 2, product of any 3 consecutive numbers is divisible. That's why it's already empty.
That's right. Good. Any other question? Okay. Good. So we can't contract with G upper Ij. We can contract with G upper Ik. The only other choice would have been IL or JK or JL, and all of them give me the same answer up to a plus or minus sign. So this thing is defined to be R J. Now this terminology is a bit confusing because we keep using the symbol R and we are supposed to identify what it is by the number of indices. So this is a kind of R with 2 indices and it goes by the name of the Ricci tensor. And its key property is that it's symmetric. RJL is equal to RLJ. The way to see that is that this was symmetric in the first pair and last pair. So we have lost one index from each of the first pair and last pair, but it retains its symmetry in the remaining indices. So this can be proved from the original property and the definition. Okay. Finally, if I take now this Ricci tensor and further contract both the indices, since it's symmetric, I am able to do that, then this thing is called R. Now it has no indices, so it's a scalar, and it's called the Ricci scalar. Okay? And there sort of ends our game, and I can write down for you a theorem, which I really have no intention of proving because I am not trying to do a rigorous course on geometry, but it's intuitively quite obvious and it's extremely useful for everything we are going to do. In fact, it's key for everything we are going to do. So the theorem is up to combinations let's say up to combinations with G, that is up to multiplication by various forms of the metric, R I J K L is the unique tensor involving exactly 2 derivatives of the metric. So of course, up to combinations with G means I am also allowed to talk about the Ricci tensor and the Ricci scalar. I see those as special cases because they are combinations of G with Rijk. Okay. Now there are other things one can write which are also combinations. For example, you could imagine a tensor Rijkl plus Gij Rkl. Nobody stops you taking this linear combination. Okay, but this is again an allowed combination between Rijkl, the 4-index R, and some matrix. So this is a new 4th rank tensor, if you like, and easily you can see this doesn't share the symmetries of Rijkl. Okay, but whatever it is, it's built from the same building block. So I hope you are sort of convinced that Rijkl is the building block for any tensor you can make. Okay, which has precisely 2 derivatives of the metric. This contains within its definition 2 derivatives of the metric, and this does also. Okay, as well as factors of the metric. Is that clear? So e.g. this is such a combination. Things would be different if we were for some reason interested in 4 derivatives of the metric on G. Okay, then we could take squares of the Riemann tensor. Those would have 4 derivatives totally. But we could also take the second covariant derivative, dij of the Riemann tensor. That also has 4 derivatives. So as we go up in number of derivatives, things become more and more complicated. So this nice thing is true only at the level of 2 derivatives. Now, why am I harping on two derivatives? What is so nice about that? Something in physics which tells us two derivatives are good. Most basic equations of physics are second order partial differential equations. So, at the end of this exercise, we need to find some equations which are suitable equations for general relativity, and we expect there will be second order partial differential equations. So therefore, Rijk would be the building block, and in fact the only building block of those equations, other than combinations of that with G, with the method. Okay. Not only that, if you go back in your notes to the second lecture or third lecture of this course, I gave you some kind of heuristic derivation from Newton's law of gravity, what that equation should look like in a weak field approximation. And now we've got the ingredients which will tell us uniquely what the equation should look like in general. And then we'll be able to check that it reproduces an equation we derived 2 or 3 lectures back. So that will be my strategy. For that, I only need to prove one more little identity, and then we are actually done. This is very beautiful, and it also happens to exist in Gauge theory. It's called the Bianchi identity, and this identity says that if I take R, J, K, L, M and take its covariant derivative with respect to Xi, now I sum over all cyclic permutations of I, J and K. Then this is 0. Please don't confuse this with the cyclic identity I derived earlier. Earlier it was an identity just on R by cyclically permuting 3 indices of R. Now I'm differentiating R, so this is a 3 derivative object, and I'm cyclically permuting I, J and K, 1 index in the derivative and 2 inside R. Okay? So this thing is 0. So how would we, so this is the identity, how would we go about proving it?
Use the covariant tensor and then use the commutator definition of Rijk.
Yes. If you use the commutator definition of Rijk it might help. I don't see it as being the fastest way to. Yeah, probably you're right, because it would probably, you're right. That's a good point. Using the commutator definition, thank you, it would finally reduce to the Jacobi identity on 3 differential operators, Di, Dj and Dk. That's one way. There's another much more explicit way, which is just to look at the definition of R in Riemann normal coordinates. Okay, it's the second derivatives of G. Taking this extra derivative is third derivatives of G. You can drop the connection term in this in Riemann normal coordinates because that's 0. The only thing you should worry about is that in normal coordinates we have dropped the gamma term in R. And when we differentiate, we should be worried because first derivative of gamma is not 0. But remember, the term we dropped was gamma times gamma. So if I differentiate gamma times gamma, then one of the gammas survives, other one gets differentiated. The one which survives is 0 in normal coordinates. So we can actually ignore the terms that we had ignored before for this purpose, and then it's a very simple identity. So both methods are good. Proof, use R. I'm not going to spell out the proof. This is one. The other method of proof is use Riemann normal coordinates. In both cases you have to do a little bit of detail, but it's an easy identity to prove. Now, this identity actually descends to a nice identity on the Ricci tensor and scalar, which we get by contracting in this thing with G what? So contract with 2 G's, GJL and GKM. Okay. Now if I put GJL, GKM here, I might think I can't take it inside because there is this derivative in between. But G has this nice property that is covariantly constant. That under covariant differentiation is 0. So G can float in and out past this derivative at will. And so we can actually apply G, JL, GKM and write this equation as di of R. The first term, G, JL, GKM, converts this into the Ricci scalar. The next term, we get d L of R I L. I'm not sure of the sign, I think it's a minus. And the third term we get the same, so we get this. Some textbooks also call this the Bianchi identity. Of course, it's a simple consequence of the previous Bianchi identity just by contracting with the metric. But this is of extreme importance in what we are now trying to do. So let me recast it, just reorganize the indices, and it's at something equal to 0, so I'll rescale by factor of minus half. So dl of RIL minus a half GIL times R equals 0. It's the same equation. Is that clear? I just move the minus 2 here, and then di of R is the same as dl GIL on R. So in this language, it expresses the transversality or transverse nature of a particular combination RIL minus a half GIL R. We call something a vector or tensor, we call transverse when its divergence is 0. When it's a second rank tensor, then its divergence on one of the indices being 0 would be the statement that it's transverse. And when it's in space, when it's in curved space, then of course ordinary derivative should be replaced by covariant. Okay? And this transverse tensor has a nice name. It's sometimes written capital Gij, and it's called the Einstein tensor. And it has a special property. It's the unique second rank tensor involving only two derivatives, which is transverse. Is that a believable statement? All second rank tensors can be, all second derivative tensors can be made by contracting the for index R. Okay, so to get second rank tensor, I can either write RIL or GIL times R. These are the only two possibilities for second rank. Arbitrary linear combination of them is not going to be transverse because this on this is not 0 and this on this is not 0. But this combination is 0 as a result of Bianchi identity. So it's the unique second rank symmetric two derivative tensor that is covariantly transverse. Now this is an astonishing fact because since my third lecture, we've been looking for just such a thing.
This is a generalization of the transverse.
Yeah, I'm using transverse to mean that, so yeah, it's a generalization of transverse on an ordinary vector. Del mu A mu equals 0 is the equation saying that the vector potential is transverse. So it's just a word, it describes that. Okay, transverse or divergence free, the same thing. Okay. Now let me go back to something I wrote probably in the second or third lecture of this course, which was the following equation. That box H mu nu plus eta mu nu del alpha del beta H alpha beta minus this. So this was what we had concluded based on some general arguments must be the linearized level approximation to the true equations which generalize Newton's theory after incorporating special relativity. We argued that the density which comes on the right side must be replaced by the energy momentum tensor. We argued that the scalar potential which appears in gravity must be replaced by a tensor h mu nu. And we also pointed out that the system has a symmetry which amounts to general coordinate transformations. So h mu nu must be the weak approximation to a flat metric. In other words, the metric is g mu nu equals eta mu nu plus h mu nu. And we are working to an order in which we neglect anything of higher order in h, like h squared and so on. Okay. Good. Now notice that, or recall again, that the energy momentum tensor is a particular tensor characterizing any relativistic system, and it's conserved, which means divergenceless, by virtue of translation invariance. So if we had a relativistic system with translation invariance, then in a special relativistic system, those who are not familiar with this fact should look it up in appropriate books. This is what is responsible for the fact that form momentum is conserved. Okay? The divergence precondition, which gives form momentum as the set of four conserved charges, is this. Good. Now it's reasonable to suppose that if this is true in a special relativistic system, then in curved space-time, this should become the covariant version of that, which is d mu nu equals 0. In other words, d mu nu is covariantly transverse. Okay. Now look at that equation. The right hand side is whatever I have written and it's covariantly transverse. So the left hand side better be some combination of the objects I have built up which are covariantly transverse and which in weak field limit reduce to this. Now you notice at this stage we've run out of choices. There's only one thing which is covariantly transverse to be the left hand side. So the left hand side has to be some number alpha up to a constant, has to be this. There are no two ways about it, because it's the only possibility for something that's covariantly transverse and therefore can go into that equation. Okay, and of course this is two derivative on the metric and that equation is second derivative on the metric. So far so good. But we can only fix alpha once, so we'll have to expand this out, find the term proportional to box h mu nu and thereby fix alpha. All the other terms had better match, otherwise we are sunk. Otherwise there is no consistent generalization of Newton's gravity to incorporate curved space-time. Simply not possible. Okay, so this is an example of something that often happens in theoretical physics, that you are trying to comply with certain set of principles to find a highly over-constrained system. Okay, over-constrained in the sense we found uniquely that this has to be the left-hand side, but the left-hand side has got 6 terms. Who tells us that this is proportional to that linear combination of those 6 terms? We didn't know that. We didn't use that at any stage, but it better be true. And in fact, as you can guess, it is true. So in fact, the precise statement is that We take this, it's a well-defined exercise. Replace G by eta plus H and keep only terms of first order in H. You can do that. Okay? And you find that it's minus a half times box H mu nu plus all the terms given above with exactly those coefficients, those constant coefficients, and therefore the only consistent equation that is general coordinate invariant made up of the metric and its second derivatives is this combination is equal to 16 pi G mu. A shorter way to write it would be that the left side is capital G mu nu. It's the Einstein tensor. So the equation just says Einstein tensor is equal to 16 pi G times the stress energy tensor. Okay. And this is the fundamental equation of general relativity. It's called the Einstein equation. It was minus 8 pi G. Sorry, my mistake. Sorry, something is, where is the 2? Maybe this is 8 pi G, no? 8 pi. That should have been minus 16. And then we had this minus half, which came the other side and converted minus 16 to plus 8.
Sir, I'm going to follow.
Yes.
Sir, that covariant d mu of mu equal to 0. So
Yes.
we have, on the LHS, we have to add something that is whose covariant derivative is automatically
Exactly.
0.
Yes.
And now the only choice is that r mu and half g mu.
Exactly.
Now I didn't follow that algebra, that r mu minus half g mu into r equal to minus half.
Is equal to this O. It's a fact. If I take R mu nu and calculate it for a metric which is infinitesimally close to flat space, eta plus H, then I'll get some answer. Okay. What do I expect the answer to depend on? Remember, R depends on second derivatives of the metric. So del H. Okay. Now I'm keeping first order in H, so I'll keep all the terms with del H. All the H's multiplied. There'll be terms like 1 plus H multiplying it, but there H will be set to 0 because we're not going higher order. So we'll get a bunch of terms involving del H. Now there are lots and lots of ways to put the indices on del H. In fact, there you see precisely 6 different ways to put indices on del H. Okay, the single H over here is the trace of H. Eta alpha beta H. So there are 6 different ways. All of them can appear, and all of them do appear in expanding this quantity, but they appear exactly in that combination, which justifies what we did saying earlier that Newton's law has to be generalized to something that's valid, that's compatible with special relativity. And here we are saying, well, if there's something involving metric of space-time, then it should reduce in the weak field limit to the special relativistic generalization of Newton's law. So we make these two things meet halfway. But we are lucky because this obligingly has all the right ingredients to be the correct left-hand side of this equation. So morally, you should think of this as a general equation which for the first time possesses general coordinate invariance. So here I can change coordinates at will. This is a tensor, this is a tensor, this is a tensor, the whole equation is covariant. Okay, but for weak fields, when the metric is of a form I had written for you once, where the time component is like 1 plus phi, 1 plus 2 phi, and then I expand it for weak phi, then it becomes just the Newton equation, which tells me that del squared phi is rho. Okay, and T00 becomes rho. So that is the Newton equation, and this generalizes. It can never be that we derive this from Newton's theory, of course. It's a more general theory. So all I've done is motivate it for you. But the motivation was that it has to be consistent with observed laws of physics in weak field only. Okay, because it was in weak field that we found that equation, and we also noticed that that equation has a symmetry under some transformations on H, which are nothing but linearized general coordinate transformations. Using this idea, we built up from that equation to this equation. So this is the result of the last 3 or 4 lectures, and this is sort of final. This is the equation which is analogous to Maxwell's equations or any other equations in physics, which tell you the response of a system of some field as a response to some source. So you put in some source and you get some gravitational field. Okay? If there is no source, then you have to solve the equation that this thing is equal to 0. Now, of course, one simple solution when there is no source is that the metric is eta mu nu and you have flat space-time. Okay? But first of all, that solution is not valid if there is a source. Because if I put eta mu nu for the metric, then the left side does vanish. So if there is any source, then eta mu nu cannot be a valid answer, which means space-time necessarily has some non-trivial metric any time I put a source. Now, very casually you may think the converse is true. If I don't put a source, then G has to be eta mu nu, but that's not true because it's a highly nonlinear equation. Now, we have an equation which is no longer valid only for weak G, but for weak H, but for all possible metrics. Okay, this involves second derivatives of the metric, first derivatives of the metric, inverse of the metric. Yeah, I'm just finishing. So, it's a very complicated equation, and it could even have solutions when the right side is 0. In fact, as we'll see, those solutions are black holes. Okay. So, it's a very interesting system, and from the next few lectures, we'll be pursuing this system. So, I'll stop now, and it's good I reached where I wanted to. And on Tuesday, we'll meet back in this room, but Nitin Nitsure will give you a talk from a mathematician's perspective. And it will be extremely interesting, so I urge all of you not to miss it for any reason. He's possibly the most entertaining speaker in the institute. And it will be here. There's this young scientist colloquium thing going on. I'm sorry, but I don't want to miss lectures. So I'm going to have this lecture at 2 p.m. on Tuesday, but it will be in this room. Sorry? Yes, actually, infinitesimal is not anything. It's more than that. This is some very
like this common phrase. If since there are no more questions, we can